everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to say a couple of quick words about our first speaker, and then I'll introduce our second speaker afterwards. I just want to point out before we get going, there's a couple of petitions on the back. There's, if you want a home energy audit, which is free, you pay for it every month in your electric bill, perhaps unbeknownst to you, but it's totally free, and they will do some installation. And this is very tied into what Lisa Fitzgerald will speak to as we try to tighten up our houses. So just, I'm going to put this on the back. Please sign up, and somebody from Next Step Living will get back to you. If you don't get your GWAC, any GWAC email blast from us, and we only let you know when we have either an extremely important piece of legislation that we need, but mostly it's just events, so it's not like every day you're deleting a GWAC email. It's probably once every couple of months. So our first speaker, I am so excited to have come here, is Ann Kelly, who many of you may know. Ann lives in Lexington and works for a company, an agency called Ceres, which is totally involved in climate change. And Ann was in Paris. And she is here to give us a report on what it was like to be on the ground in Paris. She was also nice enough, amidst all of what was going on in Paris, to send us an update. So if you were here at our last movie, Ann sent actually us an email to give us an update on what was happening. So she's very tied into GWAC and climate change, and she's going to give us a brief report, and her enthusiasm is infectious, and I am so excited because finally I feel positive. I feel there's a breath of hope in the air instead of what we normally feel, and Ann is going to send that all our way. So, thank you, Ricky.
We need a little technical assistance.
Because we have, oh hey Mike, how are you?
Hi.
We have, just Senator Barrett is here, one of our champions in Massachusetts.
The thumb drive.
Yeah, I just put it, it's on the thumb drive, it worked on my computer at home, and I'm just not seeing the.
Yeah, we're not seeing the thumb drive.
It's called Paris Agreement.
Oh, wait, here it is.
Oh,
Is that it?
it's just so teeny, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Once it goes off there, you get teeny.
Oh, yeah, it's really teeny, right. So don't go through all these personal.
Yeah, no, you're in.
Don't we want to see all your...
No.
There are a lot of Paris, well, there's all these great-looking Paris policemen. I'm sure. You go there after the attacks, and you want to be protected, right? You want to be safe. And, okay, so now, we just need to get it in slideshow form. It's there, but we just need to...
Yeah, and
This is really,
did you want to go into
somehow everything gets...
Down there in the corner to get
Yeah, slideshow.
You at the State House for the Press.
Well, great. That was a terrific intro and a tall order from my friend Ricky there, so I really hope that I can deliver. But I'll, initially Ricky had said, Ann will share her insights, her personal experience, which of course is, delightful, but you don't really want to hear all about the great wine and the great bread. And my comment on the police was just that, keep in mind, this was less than a month after the horrible attacks, and so I was prepared for intense security, dogs, German shepherds, hulky dudes, and there were all these wonderful French policemen there. They had these cute little corner hats on, like you wear in an ice cream parlor, and they'd sort of apologetically holding these guns, and they'd say, bonsoir, and I thought, wow, you guys are pretty good. I gotta be protected here. Of course, I interviewed a few people at the cop, and I realized that it was heavily filled with security, all plainclothesmen and women.
Technical, could you speak into the mic?
Oh,
Because
yeah, sure.
We're filming this.
Oh, we're filming. Okay, let's start over. Well, we didn't need that comment on Lex Media anyway. That was a personal observation. But I will say that one couldn't help but really admire what the French did, pulling together, bringing themselves to this task unbelievable logistics, graciousness, organization from the moment you walked in and got the water bottle that you carried the entire time up to the water stations that got you fresh water whenever you needed, to the meticulousness of recycling, which this crowd would all appreciate, to the vitally important persistence of the French Prime Minister, who continued to host these negotiations and push and push and push all hours of the night with great coffee, but making certain that this happened. When you scratched the surface of any Parisian individual you spoke to, you knew the fear was absolutely there, and they would be revealing that. But it was really touching to be in the midst of that, and I'll get teary-eyed if I spend too much time on that point. But what's important about the agreement? I don't have much time tonight, so I'm going to focus on what led up to this success, why the agreement's important, what we got out of it, and then look a little bit to what happens next. And on that point, I'm very excited about Lisa's presentation, because what she's talking about tonight in the Warren article, what really matters, is really making the deal real. And everything that the GWAC does, and all of the great local efforts, the Clean Power Plan at the federal level and at the state level, those are all of vital importance. Divestment usually comes up when I'm talking to groups, and I will step out of my Ceres role for a moment and I will comment on that. At Ceres, when we think of, my organization is a nonprofit organization, just to refresh your memory, organized in 1989 in the wake of the Exxon Valdez spill. It came together because of socially responsible investors, largely religious investors and environmentalists, who were committed to the notion that investors should be socially active in the companies they own. So what does that mean? We promote engagement, largely. It's not perfect, it's the model. It takes many models to make this work. The way that we like to think about divestment is to encourage investors to pursue portfolio decarbonization. It's the same thing. Outside of my Ceres role, my personal role, I'm really struck by the success of the divestment movement. I think that it's of vital importance. Why is that on my mind right now? Because I'm just came from New York City, where we did our investor summit. It got a ton of publicity. You may have heard it on NPR this morning. We had investors with assets under management of something like 4.2 trillion in the room at the UN, really celebrating the deal, but much more talking about the mechanics of how we're going to get this level of clean energy investment that's necessary, how to really make that happen. So we co-hosted that with Bloomberg, and there was a lot of good news that came out of it. And portfolio decarbonization came up a lot, including a whole analysis of carbon asset risk and stranded assets, which we need to avoid, obviously. And I know that this crowd knows exactly what I'm referring to. There's a lot of good news on that front. But tonight, I want to focus on this incredible agreement and what happened. And we are still I was saying at a dinner, I sort of have the sweetest hangover that I don't want to get over as a Motown girl, because it really was stunningly important, continues to be important, continues to be worth celebrating. A lot of people in our movement had said, we're not used to winning. This is weird. We quickly go to, well, that's really not going to work, or really, where's the seriousness, or it's not legally binding, or we could lose it when we get the next president. Okay, I'm going to suggest we not go to those comments, but instead make sure we have fully and completely acknowledged and celebrated what this was after 21 years of struggle. I know that contextually you all understand that an international agreement like this falls into the realm of the less developed world and the more overdeveloped world, shall I say. I like to think of overdeveloped. So that all the layers of history and mistrust that exist in the context of international development for centuries are still there. And the climate agreement really rests on the legacy, the painful legacy that represents. So it's no surprise that it's been really hard to negotiate this agreement when the overdeveloped world caused the problem and the most horrible results are falling on people who are least able to address it. You already know that context. So that's why it was so brilliant that our climate envoy, Todd Stern, came up with the notion, the fundamental distinction here about this agreement is that all countries, not just the developed countries, but all countries were invited, encouraged, strongly urged to come up with an INDC, an intended nationally determined contribution, a climate goal, basically. And lo and behold, prior to the agreement, 186 of them did. So as a threshold issue, that really made a difference. It was all in. Everybody's going to contribute. Those who created the problem, those who are victims of the problem,
were all in. That created a kind of a surround sound of support and collaboration that was pretty historic. Todd Stern himself said, you know, when we asked for those climate goals, I thought we'd be lucky if we got 50. So that's just contextually one of the jumping off points for us. So that's a colleague of mine, that's not mine, that's just the opening of the COP, but I think just contextually again, that, you know, the framework was established way back in 1992. We've had Conference of the Parties meetings for 20 years. This was the 21st. 196 nations made this agreement to keep global warming well below, at or below 2 degrees Celsius. So what really set the stage? Most of you already know this. At this audience, I realize I've used this for audience that are far less informed than the GWAC. There's no question about the certainty. 185 countries pledged before the COP opened. One of a longtime COP experts said to me, she's the right-hand person of Christiana Figueres, she said that, you know, this COP really brought the climate negotiations out of the JV leagues. She said this was actually like a real international meeting, like you would do the G7. Up to now, it was a bit this environmental thing that, oh yeah, right. And there wasn't the preparation. So the key was the 12 months before. So it was really the groundwork. It was the constant, persistent groundwork, the planning, the setting up. And part of that was setting the climate goals. Threshold matter, November 2014, Obama working out an agreement, Secretary Kerry with the Chinese. That was really seen as the game changer. Again, no surprise to you. But that had just never happened before in terms of preparing, and it certainly didn't happen before Copenhagen. You know all about the investments in renewables and how the cost has shifted enormously. We know how the damage has been seen around the world, the extreme weather events. There has been regional and national climate action, and that, of course, the world's largest emitters were active. So what did we really get? Now this is going to be at a pretty high level. At another session, I'd be glad to dive down deep into any one of the key elements. I'm really trying to just give you the most important things to take home from the agreement. A long-term mitigation goal by the end of the century. And this was talked about in our collaborative groups. I work with a lot of nonprofits and business and investor groups, and the general feeling was, no, don't count on it. Not going to happen. You can push for that, but it's just impossible that we would ever get the whole world to agree that we're going to completely decarbonize by the end of the century. But it was, we had a list of asks that we were putting out. It was sort of a framework, and we had it in a nice little folder. It's a useful thing actually for the GWAC to use on a little cardboard, and we had buckets and buckets of this framework. And at different times, different delegations said, could we have some more of those asks? Could we have your frameworks when we're taking buckets and buckets? I was going and dumping them at the Global Company, just taking them all over. We had them in different languages, and we just kept banging home long-term mitigation goal by the end of the century. So this was really important. What was stunning was that there was this stretch goal of 1.5. Again, prior to the COP, people in our world were saying, you know, that 2 degree thing, you really can't, you're really getting too aggressive, cannot push it, can't do, right? One of these lessons of social movements, right? As Al Gore said yesterday, it's always no, 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 until it's yes. So lo and behold, not only did we get to 2.0, but the agreement itself references an aspirational goal of 1.5. I should say that you could see the agreement if you go to the UNFCCC website. It's not that long, it's extremely well written, it's very accessible language. About 30 pages. The actual agreement itself is about 12. There's a lot of preamble language, but worth looking at. 5-year cycles of action. So as we know, when we set up the goals, and I know that you've memorized the US goal now, 26 to 28% reduction by 2025, based on a 2005 baseline. And that goal doesn't overwhelm you, of course not, because you all understand the extent of the problem. So what's vital is that we go back every 5 years and we ratchet up. So we've got to strengthen, we've got to go back, think about the goal, and they continually have to be strengthened. That is built into the agreement. Similarly, a global stocktake. In 2018, we're going to be reviewing, well, how's it going so far? What have these last 3 years taught us? And then that will help to influence that 2020 goal. And that will be obviously a global process, which was really important. Adaptation. Fundamental that was built into the agreement. You all know why, because there's already been not only tremendous damage, but if we don't help the less developed world to adapt to climate change through things like the Green Climate Fund, which I'm happy to talk about separately, we're simply not going to be able to be prepared. So this was much more than any other agreement, really built into the overall agreement itself. Loss and damage, referring to the serious impacts of climate change. And this is really a hard one because, you know, I'm not an international lawyer, but we all understand tort liability, and there's been a lot of loss and damage, and a lot of the island nations correctly were saying, you know, we've already suffered a lot of damage, and shouldn't we tee up legal actions against you all who started it? Real area of controversy before the COP. My friends at Oxfam were saying, you know, this could be a deal killer. Well, complicated, but there is language that says that this agreement isn't creating any new liability on the part of the developed world. There's language that talks about insurance pools and various ways of dealing with existing damage, but it was important to get through. That could have been a real sticking point. Now, I took a picture of this poster because it was all over the COP, and it was really striking to me. It doesn't have quite the same effect when in my little lousy picture here, but this was done in one of the island nations booths. So every nation is given its own little pavilion, a little area where they're, you know, talking about their country, or they're serving food, they're giving you photos of damage that's taken place. The Saudis had this massive scene. They were playing guitar music here in the Caribbean booth, and they were serving great food, but they had this poster everywhere, 1.5 to stay alive. And there I thought that the image of that little girl was just so compelling. And if you talk to any of these folks, it was like, yeah, we got to be at 1.5. The starkness of that was crystal clear. The other thing the French did in setting up the COP was that there were negotiators freely interacting with, you know, nobodies like me, NGOs, nonprofits, just in and out, back and forth. You could just sit down at a cafe with a negotiator. I met a nice woman from Burkina Faso, and just talked about what it was like to be in the thick of this. And the French made sure that that kind of access was available. So you were walking into negotiation rooms. At one point I left my coat in a room I wasn't supposed to be in. It was high security, and I said, oh, I gotta go back. It was a secondhand leather jacket. I gotta get that. And I went in, and you could just feel the tension. I said, oops, sorry, and I grabbed it and I left. But there was incredible accessibility throughout the entire pavilion. So why is the agreement important? And I do include why it's important for businesses only because if you think back to what did we need from this deal? Well, there's two essential things we needed to make the deal real, to make it create change. First off, we needed it to send a strong enough investment signal to shift capital around the world from high carbon fuel sources to low carbon fuel sources. Fundamentally, it had to send a signal to the investment world, this is real. We're actually making this shift now. Secondly, and no less important, in some ways more important, it needed to be fair and equitable. It needed to resolve this existing dilemma about rich countries, poor countries, those who caused the problem, those who are victimized by the problem. Are we going to actually take care of those who have suffered? So those were really two fundamental issues. And I'm going to argue that we feel like it got the first one. And I was just with these all these investors saying, yes, we got the signal, we get it. This is actually going to have to shift now. I think on the fair and equity question, it needs our daily vigilance. And our colleagues from Oxfam are very fluent on this. We're working, I'll talk about the Green Climate Fund in a moment, but we have to continue to lobby hard the U.S. Congress for adaptation funding throughout the world, and in Alaska, as it turns out, having talked to Senator Murkowski's office. The agreement is global in scope, so it's also sending this real message that all supply chains will be affected, you know, all nations. This is good news for people who have vulnerable supply chains, rice, cotton, coffee, leather. All those crops and the people who grow them need adaptation funding as well, so that creates all sorts of opportunity. It's really important. Obviously, all major governments are now acting. It isn't just a few. And again, this is what hampered earlier agreements. It was only about a few countries. This is all in, and the digital age is really helping to facilitate that kind of all-in collaboration. You're in it to win it. We're going to make this work. The agreement will also outlive any one political cycle, any one government or political cycle. There's plans made for the 5-year ratchet mechanism to go forward from here. And just remember, even though this was a stunning success, COP22 will happen. Plans are in place now for Marrakesh, Morocco, November 2016. Full on, and all the interim meetings that happen in Bonn between now and then are also full in force. So I'm happy to talk more about Paris, but I want to highlight a little bit of I feel the tension around what from here. It's great that we have this incredible agreement. If you saw the moment when that gavel came down, it was stunning, and the look on the people's faces, and I can tell you they had been up for days and nights. The relief was overwhelming. I was actually back home in Lexington. It was very hard to leave Paris, but that was just my plan. The gavel came down, and Minister Fabia said, "It's amazing what one little gavel can do," and he hit it again, and that meant that's it, we're in. And people were just in utter disbelief. So for me, it was one of those, like, where were you when 9/11 hit? It was of that level of significance. But, and by the way, April 22nd is a date to note. That's when countries will come together in New York and sign the agreement. So it's another really important, if there's an important announcement or milestone or march to have happen, April 22nd is Earth Day. There will be a coming together in New York, and that's significant. There is no suggestion that any country is pulling out, by the way. Okay, so what do we still have to work on? Price on carbon, fundamental. That's one of the things we asked for in the deal we didn't get. We all wanted a price on carbon. We wanted a global price on carbon that would be designed such that you could link jurisdictions from country to country. It's extremely complicated. You may have noticed it's extremely complicated to get a price on carbon or a carbon tax at the federal level in one jurisdiction, the U.S. It's actually extremely difficult to get a carbon tax right here in our home state of Massachusetts. So Senator Barrett and Zori Zimmerman are going to make that happen. There was universal agreement at this summit. Really fine work being done in Massachusetts, and the summit we just held in New York, from Al Gore to Mike Bloomberg, who spoke, to Christiana Figueres, to every economist that got up said, well, of course, what we need is a price on carbon. Well, when we start pricing carbon, well, when we inevitably price carbon, and when we get our carbon pricing scheme. So this is the fundamental work of the moment, and I could talk about a million different models. We do have to look at distribution really carefully. Obviously, have to make sure that this is fair and equitable. I won't get into any specifics. If you want specifics on the Massachusetts bill, you've got the experts right here. But it also really makes sense to be doing this at the state level because, as always, like all of our environmental laws started at the state level. You know that. The laboratories of experimentation, like Brandeis said, it can bubble up to the federal level. My office is going to keep working at this at the federal level, however, and really trying to build a post-partisan narrative. We've had Republicans reach out to us with lots of enthusiasm about carbon pricing, in part because of the profound dislike of the Clean Power Plan, of which we are huge proponents. But there's a really constructive tension there, I think, and if you have a price that's appropriate carbon tax, it may in fact mean that you don't need the Clean Power Plan. But that said, we are full gusto of the Clean Power Plan now. That's why it's my #1 federal priority that I list, and I'm sure you all poured champagne last Thursday when we had that incredible victory in the DC circuit. The opponents to the Clean Power Plan had attempted to stay the rules. They attempted to stop the plan while the lawsuit ensues, and they lost on that because the court said no, it does not cause irreparable harm to keep this going. So, exciting. Federal heavy-duty truck standards, we still have to keep looking at transportation, and the feds have put out some important standards on the largest trucks that ship all of our goods. Those need to be tightened up. They have to be extremely efficient, and methane standards go without saying. Those are out for comment as well. The Green Climate Fund. This gets to the adaptation in the Paris Agreement. One of the many broken promises from Copenhagen was the money that was to go into the Green Climate Fund to the tune of $100 billion to pay for all the adaptation expenses that less developed countries and island nations need. It's really important that the U.S. do its part and make sure that other countries do their part to make the fund real. We had an appropriations battle this fall, thanks to Republican Senator Kirk of Illinois and Senator Merkley, so Republican Democrat. They really worked to get rid of any rider on the appropriations process so our first slug of funding could go into the fund. But this is really important, and we're going to continue to push for it. Lots of other NGOs are doing the same. And overall, we still have to build support for climate action. This goes without saying as well, many different movements. So even though we have this agreement, there's many other movements have to keep going. I just don't want to suggest that because we have a global agreement that means that we can rest for a moment, because the urgency is as great as ever. But what's exciting is that we have this boost that, as I said, we're not used to winning. We can point to this now, And it's sending a signal and a level of accountability that we've just never had access to before. That was the U.S. Center in Paris. The U.S. did a lot of grand events, announcements. That's me. I was trying to, put the world on my shoulders. I did not do that very effectively. Despite their pain, despite it being high security, and despite it only being a month after the attacks, I thought it was notable the way the French decorated the Champs-Élysées with Christmas lights. And you can't believe, my photo barely captures it, but I was on a little balcony when IKEA had a little reception as they were, again, committing to be 100% renewable. And I just had to take that picture as a parting shot. It was light. People were out. They were out shopping, and they were celebrating that. Gosh, Christmas actually brought people back out to the shops again because so many of the cafes had been empty and the shops were not getting much foot traffic. So there was this incredible metaphor of people coming together in impossible circumstances to make this happen, even after those tragic attacks. So I'm very interested in your questions, and so I'd like to open it up before taking any more of your time. So why don't we do that? Yes, Charlie.
Excuse me. Although there wasn't, an agreement on going forward with a price on carbon, my understanding was that several European leaders, including Germany, France, and other countries, were setting up a working group to figure out actually how to do that. Are you aware of that, or did you hear?
There is a European working group to figure out how to do that, and there's also the World Bank has set up a massive coalition on carbon pricing that includes government leaders and investors and companies and NGOs, and there's a tremendous effort there. I remember 3 years ago you couldn't say carbon tax in Washington. You would just, you were, it was just like you were bringing up, you were toxic. Now, every Republican group is reaching out to us saying, can we talk to you about pricing carbon? Can we show you our model? So there's a lot of great working groups going on, but especially in Europe. Yes. Very hopeful on that front. Yes.
Hi. I've just been listening to somebody called Carolyn Lucas, head of the Green Party in the UK, which is definitely struggling. But she made a great point, I think. And not first and foremost, what all environmentalists should be doing, just about everybody in politics should be doing, is getting the science out there. And I don't know, it's tough to plow through the science. I see the whole issue of the science being extremely complex and abstruse, long chains of evidence. In climate science, more than any other science, you have to look up the fossil record. You have to do things that nobody understands. And it's an essential part of the problem, is communicating this science to the public directly. And there have been PV programs and everything, but I don't know, this is maybe not anybody's field here, but it has to be. There has to be a focus on two things: getting the science, such as Hansen-Rigneau paper, that 2 degrees is dangerous. And we don't know about exactly how glaciers, how fast they slide into the sea. It turns out that looking in the paleoclimate record, you can't see that too easily. Secondly, there's this paper by called VAX, V-A-X, about permafrost risk. At 1.5, feedback kicks in. My friend and I are trying to understand this, and this is very complex, but it's essential to understand this. This is saying at 1.5 degrees, we can get an uptick because permafrost is going to start melting all over this is ground permafrost, let alone the seabed permafrost. All hell is about to break loose, not decades ahead, but years down the road. And the climate mobilization is one of the only groups that keeps on message about that. And we have got to go directly to the public. At some point, there has to be an investment in communication to the public of, more and more. There have been great series, the Vice series, the Years of Living Dangerously, but they have to just be on the airwaves constantly. There has to be saturation until the public starts to get what we will be living in. ISIS will be the rule of the day. Little, droughts in the Middle East, and we have ISIS pouring all over the place and deranged fanatics trying to kill people at random all over the place. San Bernardino. Every fanatic is being drawn in because we have a whole region of the world becoming uninhabitable, which happens to be the Islamic world.
You're raising something really
Yeah, so I
important.
just will shut up for now, but I have lawyers from the climate mobilization. We have to be on a different wavelength here.
I
people.
love your
We have to be on a
enthusiasm.
different wavelength. I'm not enthusiastic, I'm terrified. We have to get on a new wavelength. We're going to have terrorists everywhere in a few years. Because the whole Islamic world is becoming uninhabitable. And they have bombs. And Pakistan and India have tons of bombs. A nuclear winter will put us all under. 50 bombs makes a nuclear winter. Pakistan and India are just ready to start one off in a few years.
You mentioned
We have got
science.
to get on emergency, world, global emergency.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you, and that's why I've devoted my work to this. The last time I spoke in this room, I started off with a science presentation with a lot of the latest findings from Al Gore. And there was a gentleman in the first row. I layered on many slides, and I showed some statistics and some pictures and some extreme weather. I had about 30. And I asked for feedback afterwards on how it went.
Damn truth.
And the gentleman in the front row said, you know, the more you got into the science and just how tragic this was, I found myself wanting to back away. I said, really? You're my Lexington neighbor? And he said, yeah, I got to be honest with you. And a few other people said, yeah, that's kind of how it affected us too. And I took that to heart. The good news is we've learned a lot since May 2006 when Al came out with his incredible film, An Inconvenient Truth. And one of the things we've learned, and I was trained, like many of you probably were, by Al to go and give science presentations. He's trained tens of thousands of people around the world now to go to their neighbors with urgency, with fear, with fantastic data, really updated, fantastic data, video about the very crisis you're talking about. And I think we've learned a few things, and this isn't so unlike what we've learned with social marketing over the years, and part of this has to do with our evolutionary instincts. We've actually learned that a lot about what actually motivates people and what doesn't motivate people. And we're still learning that. Now, I was one of those people who thought if you just give people the facts, if the brochure is right, if the graphs are true, your data is right, you are going to move people. Well, I was wrong. It turns out that moves some people. And other people need other things that move them. We learned that tribal pressure, and we're a tribe, let's be honest, that's not a derogatory term. The Lexington tribe, the Democratic tribe, whatever your tribe is. We've learned that what your neighbors are doing are important. We've learned that social pressure is important. We've learned that immediacy is important, and that things that are far off are harder for people to act upon. So there seems to be a general consensus that the science is vital for decision makers. We've done 13 investor summits in New York. Bringing these folks together. This is the first one where we didn't have a science presentation, and everyone said it was the best one we've ever had. And one of the reasons is that people, largely educated people like yourselves and like the group we have, largely understand the science. They're not scientists, but they have enough to know that we got to do something, and we got to act, and we have to act, and we have to act, and do things like what Lisa's about to present. So we've learned that there is a place for fear. There is certainly a place for accurate scientific data, no question about it. There are reams of it, and the White House is putting it out, and I think it's getting to the right places at the right time, including the Woods Hole Research Center, which does phenomenal work. For the majority of people, we got to act. So this is a political issue, this is a movement, and we have to absolutely support that. Yes?
Hi. To kind of take an alternative view to what he was talking about, it's tough to, I'm assuming everyone here in this room believes in climate change and have come to their own agreement to it. And the details, everyone comes to their own path. But on the other hand, you have certain candidates of a particular political party that say things like, you're a Neanderthal if you believe in climate change, and I'm not sure if it means that he actually believes in creationism or not, or that it's a Chinese conspiracy, or literally of the dozen candidates that were running, there were 2 that were actually supporting climate change, and both of them bowed out before the end of the 2015. What I'm saying,
Well,
as you
actually,
said, it's
Christie
pressure.
accepts climate change.
What?
Christie is still going. He accepts climate change.
Really?
Being human caused, yes, he does.
Does he not? Does he think we can do something about it?
I don't know, but
He's backed off.
he did also
Well, in
hug
any case, let's move
President
on to the
Obama,
question.
which I think
In any case,
hurt him, but it's
The tribal pressure.
symptomatic of it. He does accept the causation.
The tribal pressure, as you were saying, to address climate change. how do we make it a national issue when it comes to the elections, when it comes to the debates, when the forums and the discussions and the debates that they've had so far, one party acknowledges it and the other party is talking about ranking and stature more than anything else. I mean,
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it, because I'd love to make a very concrete suggestion that just from a meeting I had at 7:30 this morning. I hadn't been thinking enough about the election, but at the end of September, you might remember that there was this tremendous climate march many of you took part in the fall of 2014. And that was at the opening of the UN. It's New York Climate Week. It's a big event. We've just been asked to co-host it. I wanted to get control of that event forever and really hit it out of the park. There's no question that pre-election, that is a golden moment. I mean, right now, it's very difficult to think about who the candidates are going to be. I'm with you 100% on how difficult it is to with this particular party and what they're saying. But I think when we get to the actual candidate, you are going to see the pressure mount for this party to come up with a narrative. Confidentially, members of the party have reached out to my office to say, can you help us with a narrative? Can you help us with a conservative narrative that would allow us to take a position? And to be honest with you, most of the groups reaching out to me about getting a price on carbon are Republican organizations. The Niskanen Institute, R Street, there's many different think tanks that are saying, this actually would make a lot of sense. And if you price carbon, you have a market solution. All the economists have agreed upon it. And I believe when we get out of the craziness of this particular primary season, that things will get more serious, especially as the reality of Paris sinks in, as that capital starts to shift, as we start to really see decisions being made. And from where I sit, I work with Republican governors, like from my home state of Michigan, Governor Snyder, who said, we're going to implement Obama's Clean Power Plan. In our state, wind is now cheaper than coal. Those are just the facts. This is what's happening. There's a lot of Republicans that completely support clean energy. I can show you a poll that says Republicans support clean energy. That's the word that works. Okay, that's fine. Climate change may not always work as a term, but purchasing renewables do. That's cool. That's fine. Purchase a lot of renewables, and Iowa and Texas now have more wind than anywhere else in the country. We need to keep working on, the cost of solar and wind going down. It was a huge victory to get the tax credits. The wind tax credit, the solar tax credit for 5 years. We've never had that before. It's always been this little 1 year handicap. So I see points of light that break through the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing right now in that party. And I actually am seeing some pretty thoughtful conservative thinkers, moderates. The youngest woman in the US Congress today ever elected is 32 years old, Elaine Stefanik from upstate New York. She is a firecracker. She said, I'm Republican, I'm millennial, I get it. I get climate change. We're going to have a millennial task force. We're going to solve this thing. I am inviting her to Boston, and I'm happy to have all of you come and hear her, to stand next to Senator Whitehouse, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's the best Democrat on climate change in Congress, and have the two of them together. Because if we're not, I want to model building a post-partisan narrative and building a bridge and really being able to reach out. Representative Chris Gibson, Republican from upstate New York, got 12 other Republicans in the House to sign his climate resolution that says, human cause, we got to do something about this. We're really supporting him. Elaine signed his resolution. So, it may not show up on Fox News, but there actually are some pretty thoughtful actions going on behind the scenes that I would point to. So, point well taken. Other thoughts or observations or questions? Yes.
How much of a big business, how many big companies do you know that are behind carbon pricing? I mean, we hear now and then some announcements, but if you look at it as a percentage of big business, say in America, where do we stand?
Yeah, well, that's my favorite question. So, super softball there. Ricky doesn't let me go on forever. But were you to look at progress on climate change, the private sector would be the leading indicator of change. The law is the lagging indicator right now. It happens. That's what democracy's about, The Civil Rights Act, when we finally got it signed in 1964, people got it long before. So Microsoft has an internal price on carbon. They not only set an internal price on carbon and are purchasing 100% renewables, but they wrote a playbook about how to do that for other companies. Most of the companies that I work with, I can give you a long list from IKEA to Facebook to Mars to Procter & Gamble. I'm listing companies that are not left, okay? Procter & Gamble is not a left-wing outfit, just so you know. Mars, private company, $34 billion a year, Virginia-based, not a lefty company. M&M's, okay? 100% renewable, they're going to. They said, well, we just did the math. We're just doing the numbers. Facebook, again, you'd be surprised, but they are not a left company at all. They have people, well, I happen to know of serious doubters within the company, let's not go there. But Zuckerberg, Mark did stand up just before Paris to be part of the investment coalition, the Breakthrough Coalition, along with Mission Innovation, to help to do some of those risky loans, those risky investments that are hard to do. But all the companies I just mentioned and several others have pledged to be 100% renewable. But what does that really mean? Well, that means when they go to put a data center, true story, they go to Michigan, what wind do you got for me? Not much. They go to Iowa, Iowa has the wind, guess where the data center went? That's economic development. So Michigan's saying, oh, well, what are we, chopped liver? Well, no, you just didn't have wind for us. And that conversation is going on. Procter & Gamble went to Georgia and said, look, we set a public goal. And there's this really interesting apolitical nature to that. It's just like, we got a deal here. So that's creating a market pull that is really changing the game. And I could give you a long list of companies that are doing just that. A company I talked to today comes from the home state of where Zori is from, Kentucky. And they want to do something massive, really massive. They said, you got to keep this confidential. We really want to do it massive. And what they said was really wise. They said, you know, we don't want to stick it in the face of the Kentucky delegation. We want to bring them in. So what you really want to do is to create something that can create a win in a language for the Kentucky delegation to say, well, yeah, this is what we're looking for. This is economic development. We can get behind that. If it's a good thing and it's 100% renewable, do we really care if they use the words global warming? No. We can't get locked in. We got to think expansively, and we got to be bringing in partners now, because the gentleman in back was right. It is desperate. Al Gore gave the best talk he's ever given yesterday at our luncheon in front of our 500 investors, and you knew he was from Nashville. It was like the preacher coming out in him. And I'll send you the link.
Oh,
And he had both the scientific data and the numbers, and he had the passion. He nailed it. And we were kind of like, yeah, Al, tell us what you really think. But you could feel him now, of course, you know, older. You could feel him looking at his watch almost, like this is what my legacy, this is one, you know, I don't get to say this that many more times. So feel the urgency, but let's get it done constructively, and a piece of that has to be negotiating with our Republican friends. Yes, sorry.
Is the Carbon Disclosure Project the best list of global companies with internal price on carbon?
Yes. Zori's referring to CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. They have a publication that lists all the companies that are currently imposing an internal price on carbon.
They keep it up to date?
They keep it up to date.
If you want to go look, that's the place to
Yes,
go.
it is an excellent source. It's
Does
an
that
excellent
include
source.
Apple and Google, or either one of them? Are they in that?
Microsoft is, you know, I'm not sure about Apple and Google. Both have committed to be 100% renewable. Google went as far as to enter the lawsuit challenging the Clean Power Plan, and I can send you their declaration, where they said, no, ending these rules are not calling us irreparable harm. These rules are closing down coal-fired power plants and allowing the price of renewables to come down, so we very much want them. And Google is not a joiner, I'm just telling you. But they put themselves on the line in this lawsuit. And I think you're going to see more companies doing an internal price on carbon. It is important. My personal bias is that we mobilize around the kind of external policy-wide price on carbon that Senator Barrett is promoting, because we gotta get this in as an economy-wide matter and get it soon. And you will see more efforts like this around the world. Yes?
Will you please tie the water crisis into the climate problem and advise folks like us who don't really suffer from a water crisis how to prepare for it and join forces to prevent it?
A great question, especially as we look at our friends in California. And right now, our work and all of our grant money, my own water team is focusing on California as a pilot. If we could get California right on so many levels, it would help us throughout. So we all know about the linkage, the water-climate nexus. A huge amount of attention and funding is going into water protection, largely about quantity, somewhat about quality. I grew up in Detroit, I have relatives in Flint, so don't even get me started on the tragedy that represents. But I would say that there's obviously the scientific link, I think you all know that, so I don't think we really have to go there. There's a huge effort to look at agriculture I mean, let's just look at the biggest users. So there's been a lot of analysis on where the biggest users are, and there's no question that we have to do much better water stewardship in agriculture. There are a few standout companies like Driscoll Berries. You see them at Stop and Shop. They're doing great work. There's a few innovators, not enough. We have to price water in the same way. Metaphor, I mean, we got to figure out, right now, you can use far too much, far too cheaply. That's how we look at it, as a market problem. It's just free. So it ends up being wasted. And at the same time, the deserving poor families in Flint aren't getting it cleanly. So there's huge inequities. The good news on it is we did learn a lot of lessons in assessing climate risk and understanding climate risk and forcing entities, jurisdictions, cities, states, companies to assess climate risk and look at it. And so I think we can learn from that as we look at water. We have we're pushing water stewardship, better water management. It is not easy, and it has a real low, your point is well taken, because so many places will have too much water, others will have not enough. Very, very local in nature. And so what we're doing right now is really working with the state of California. Hats off to Governor Brown, who's given a mandate about water use for individuals, for businesses. The third rail, I just started talking to Unilever about this, is PC, personal care. Because to us, it's about you, the amount of water that we use as individuals. If you look at the individual water use of the average American, the average Swede, the average French person, the average Nigerian, you are amazed at just how much we overuse. And we know that the climate comes in when you look at the temperature of water. So extremely complex, very much needs our ingenuity. And I think we get a little bit spoiled here because of the abundant water resources. But you're absolutely right to be thinking about it. And I would say that nearly half of our work now is moving toward water.
Thank you.
One last question for Ann.
Yes.
With the Beacon Hill fracas going on with net metering, is this a turf grab between the customers generating their own power versus the utilities wanting hydropower? And also with that, the turf grab is who is, I think what the governor was talking about solar being 2 to 3 times more expensive than other things, but yet it's a capital investment, and it's the customers that are doing the capital investing, not burdening it on the utilities. Do you have any insight on the turf grab?
We are so lucky to have Senator Barrett in the audience. And I would love to invite you to comment on that, since you're right at the helm of it all.
Why, thank you. Could you repeat the question?
Do you want to repeat the question?
The turf grab between utilities and the customers, as far as net metering goes, is this one of those things that the governor is trying to get in hydropower so that the utilities provide the electricity and not the customers? Is there some sort of a turf grab there? I can't get my head wrapped around what's going on in Beacon Hill.
Well, very briefly, the net metering, which we could have done and should have done probably by itself last year, or even in the last legislative session, so that we could have made sure that solar got unstuck, has now become a pawn in a larger game, as you're implying. The game grows ever larger. It may grow so large that it will redound to our benefit again. That would be nice. We need to get beyond the governor's Quebec hydro suggestions and get to offshore wind. Then we probably need to enlarge the conversation to include all manner of energy efficiency steps. And really, if there's going to be a truly comprehensive energy bill, we need to put a price on carbon in Massachusetts. So the conversation grows to an intermediate size and you're troubled. If it gets truly large, I think it's an opening for those of us who would like to see a lot done.
Thank you. That was comprehensive.
And Ann, terrific presentation in general. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, Senator Barrett, and thank you for all your good work.
For anybody who wants to hear more from Ann, and I don't know how much of this is going going to be repeated on the first Friday, but from my standpoint, I could hear it over and over again. Anne will be speaking for the League of Women Voters First Friday event, which will be, well, the first Friday is February 5th. I didn't have it on my calendar, so I assume it's February 5th. It's in this room. At 9 o'clock is coffee, 9:30 we'll begin the conversation. So tell your neighbors who were not able to come tonight to come to that if they want to hear more about the Paris Agreement. I want to say one thing regarding the solar issues. If you go to our website, lexgwac.org, we will be posting links to some of the problems we're having now in regard to net metering and the house bills and trying to get things to move forward, or whether it's time for you to write somebody and say, please, this is how I want you to vote. Because, you know, we're a participatory democracy, and you need to tell your congresspeople and your senators how you want them to vote and why. So we're now going to move to exploring net zero in Lexington. I thank you all for coming, especially any town meeting members who are going to get an opportunity to vote on this warrant. And if you're not a town meeting member, then you need to speak to your town meeting members. Their addresses are public, and you just need to reach out and get active, as Ann said. This is a, you know, we're starting from the ground. There's top stuff, and there's the groundswell. And the groundswell is very important. And if any of you came to see the movie by Naomi Klein, This changes everything. She was very clear about how the ground game works, and that's just, there's no debate about that. This is Lisa Fitzgibbons, who represents Mothers Out Front, but also joins our GWAC meetings because we have obviously a tremendous amount of overlap. Lisa spearheaded getting net zero, the concept of net zero into Lexington. And in September, we had Quentin Zondervan and Henrietta Davis from Cambridge, who have this in place in Cambridge. They're 2 years into it, and we are following their model because it's worked there. You know, and Lisa will talk to how we're going to approach it in Lexington. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for sharing your exciting learnings from Paris and from your Investor Summit. My name is Lisa Fitzgibbons of Mothers Out Front Lexington team. Mothers Out Front is building a movement of mothers, grandmothers, and caregivers committed to ensuring a livable planet for our kids. Like all of you, we are deeply concerned about climate change and want to see a swift transition to a clean energy economy driven by renewable energy resources. We're inspiring our members to take action individually, in their communities, at the state and the national level to support clean energy choices. We are working closely with allies like Sustainable Lexington and LexGWAC, as well as our legislators like Senator Mike Barrett, at the state and national level to push for policy changes and regulatory changes that will protect our children's future in the face of climate change. It is my privilege to be here tonight on behalf of Sustainable Lexington, LexGWAC, and Mothers Out Front to discuss an opportunity that we think is both exciting and imperative for Lexington. That opportunity is net zero. This is the brief agenda. We'll talk quickly about the urgency, which you all understand, the role of local governments, the objective, a few examples, the opportunity for Lexington, and the warrant article. Here we have Climate Interactive's thermometer scoreboard. And at the bottom end, you'll see 2 degrees. And as many of us in this room know, the unanticipated effects of warming that scientists are currently seeing lead many to think 1.5 to stay alive, as Anne told us from Paris. At the high end, you see the projected temperature by 2100 if we continue on business as usual. If all the global proposals to limit emissions are implemented from the Paris agreements, we'll be in the 2.7 to 3.5 range. What you see is there's a big gap between 2.7 and 3.5 to 2 degrees or even 1.5. That gap is where local and regional action comes in. As Ricky just said, climate change will take simultaneous top-down and bottom-up approaches. We are that bottom-up approach. Local governments are on the front lines of climate change. According to the United Nations Development Program, local governments implement more than 70% of climate change reduction measures and up to 90% of adaptation measures. Local governments can lead the fight against climate change by promoting public transport, renewable energies, supporting green buildings and retrofits, and protecting our natural habitat. We can mobilize communities, forging partnerships among stakeholders, prioritizing investments, and acting more nimbly and creatively than larger government bodies. And we are uniquely positioned to engage, educate, and stimulate our communities and our citizens to take action. So what can we do in Lexington to help close that gap? We can take responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions that we generate. And we can tackle the biggest single source of those emissions, our buildings. According to Sustainable Lexington, 66% of our town's emissions come from our buildings. We can work to reduce those emissions to as close to zero as possible. So what is net zero? There are different definitions. You'll hear net zero energy, zero net source energy, net zero emissions, net zero cost. You can also hear a difference in scope, buildings, communities, regions. The basic concept behind net zero is that sources and uses cancel one another out. A simple example, a net zero building. The energy generated by the building equals the energy used by the building. What we're proposing for Lexington is a goal of net zero emissions from our building sector. Net zero emissions implies achieving a carbon footprint that in effect adds no new carbon emissions to the atmosphere. You achieve this through a combination of energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy production and purchase, and where necessary, the purchase of carbon offsets or credits so that any remaining CO2 emissions are sequestered or offset by measures designed to reduce emissions. Anything less than net zero is fueling a climate crisis that will be catastrophic for the planet. This is the rubric for net zero emissions. All communities pursuing it follow these principles. You report an ongoing assessment of a building's performance. You reduce, implementing energy efficiency improvements. You produce, you maximize on-site renewable energy production, and you purchase clean renewable energy for the remainder. These are some of the communities that are pursuing net zero. Austin, Texas, Seattle, Washington, Fort Collins, Colorado, all have goals of achieving net zero emissions community-wide by 2050. Our neighbor, Somerville, Mass, has the same goal, carbon neutrality by 2050. Montpelier, Vermont aspires to be the country's first state capital to be net zero. And Palo Alto, California is currently updating their climate action plan. Beyond considering the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, they're considering a moonshot goal of achieving net zero by 2025. Let's take a closer look at two of these communities. Fort Collins recently accelerated their goals to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The scope is community-wide with targets in all sectors generating emissions. They plan to reach their building targets through efficiency and solar. The time frame is 35 years. Cambridge is doing what we are proposing for Lexington. Their goal is to achieve net zero emissions in the city's building sector by efficient building design and retrofits, improved operations, and renewable energy supply, and where necessary, offsets. The time frame is over 25 years. So how did these communities start down the net zero path? They established task forces of diverse stakeholders and subject matter experts, and each of those task forces conducted a rigorous process of exploring the net zero challenge. Cambridge had representation from community advocates, residents, universities, the planning board, business, property owner, developers, realtors, and subject matter experts. They created 4 working groups that tackled key topics: regulation and planning, financing and incentives, energy supply and offsets, education and engagement. They hired experienced consultants to advise them on the subject and to facilitate the process. The timeline for their task force was 16 months. What did the Cambridge team accomplish in those months? They worked with consultants to understand the city's building stock and its contribution to emissions. They sought out statistical models, best practices, and developed an energy supply primer to look at source alternatives. They built buy-in across a diverse set of stakeholders. They generated ideas and strategies through their working groups. They produced a final report of recommendations for their city council with a roadmap and timeline for getting to net zero. They engaged and educated their citizens. The plan was adopted by the City Council last June, and Cambridge is working on implementation. Consultants played a critical role in informing the task force. Integral Group of Vancouver, British Columbia was the overarching consultant. They have advised 41 communities on achieving net zero targets. They provided support on tools and technical support, and they helped at all stages of developing the action plan. They partnered with Peregrine Group on baseline research and Sustainable Performance Institute on facilitation, a critical piece to achieving achievable sets of recommendations. Like Cambridge, Fort Collins approached the challenge by forming a partnership of diverse stakeholders. They had town government, community leaders, Fort Collins Municipal Utility, Colorado Clean Energy Institute, and Rocky Mountain Institute. This group together explored how far and how fast Fort Collins could go to devise a clean, renewable, secure energy future. It was a collaborative, community-wide goal-setting process that developed strategies to implement landmark levels of efficiency, clean technologies in building, transportation, and other sectors, and that required behavioral changes to achieve the savings. They brainstormed rapid scaling of key approaches and technologies to drive down costs, and they created a new electric utility business paradigm that they are piloting this year in 2016. Fort Collins relied on advice of consultants as well. They used Rocky Mountain Institute and the Institute's eLab. Here you see the business case for Fort Collins accelerating its climate action plan. You can see that their green investments just about break even in 2030, and the net present value is quite positive in 2050. Buildings are part of this. Net zero buildings have lower operating costs than traditional buildings. These savings make a big difference in savings over the life of the building. Not only are operating costs lower, but they're predictably lower because renewable energy prices are less volatile than fossil fuel prices. Interest rates continue to be low, so financing costs are low. Furthermore, studies have found that rental prices for green buildings are higher. So is the resale value. In fact, the higher your green rating, let's say LEED Platinum versus LEED Silver, the higher your boost in value. Studies have demonstrated that green buildings have health and productivity benefits. A recent Harvard study found that higher cognitive performance is associated with lower concentrations of carbon dioxide. It found that for every 400 parts per million increase in the concentration of CO2 in the indoor environment, cognitive performance dropped by 21%. Most notable declines seen in crisis management, reasoning, and strategy. The other thing they found in this study is that many of the schools in the United States have rates of carbon dioxide concentration that are in the 2,000 range. So imagine taking your SATs under those circumstances. More reason to limit emissions in our buildings. In the big picture, these communities pursuing net zero have acknowledged the inevitability of change. The science and the urgency of reducing our emissions is directing investments at all levels towards clean energy and efficiency. Anne clearly is seeing this from Paris and in her investment summits. These communities are aligning their regulations and policies with carbon neutrality that science says is imperative to stay below 2 degrees centigrade. They realize that delaying in planning and implementing change in the way we operate will not only put our children's future at risk, but it will also make the necessary changes more disruptive later. They recognize that their residents are and will continue to demand healthy, energy-efficient places to live and work. And they understand that fossil fuels are not the only way to fuel economic growth. We can reduce the energy intensity of our buildings, design them to produce their own energy, and invest and purchase renewable sources for the rest of our needs. So what's the opportunity for Lexington? Pursuing net zero is a natural next step in our town's commitment to addressing climate change. In 2013, town meeting adopted our climate change resolution, which commits us to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and requires that we take climate change into effect in our town decisions and planning. A net zero goal puts teeth in this commitment. A net zero goal will have significant impact on our emissions because it tackles the biggest source of those emissions, our buildings. It focuses us on performance of our entire building stock, not just our municipal and school buildings, which only account for 2% of our carbon emissions. A net zero goal will help us meet our Global Warming Solutions Act commitment. Lexington's emissions have been flat for the last several years. Business as usual will not get us to 80% by 2050. As I mentioned, greener buildings are healthier buildings that have dramatically lower life cycle costs. The fact that they are higher performing buildings can translate into competitive advantage and a differentiator for their owners and for the town. Furthermore, Lexington is planning major capital investments in its school and municipal buildings over the next 5 years. These buildings and renovations should be designed to be healthy, energy efficient, resilient, and sustainable. A focus on net zero could inform the design and renovation of these buildings. So, if we were to pursue net zero in Lexington, what would it take? We'd start by organizing a net zero task force, an ad hoc citizens task force, not unlike the task force that we established for our solar campaign. It would include representatives from diverse stakeholder segments and subject matter experts. They would examine strategies and develop recommendations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our built environment, improve energy efficiency in new and existing buildings, support renewable energy generation, both on and off-site, and research best practices to engage and educate our users and influence occupant behavior. This is a list of major stakeholder segments developed with the input from our selectmen and Sustainable Lexington. Ideally, we would want on this task force not more than 20 folks. Cambridge had 13 to 15. If you look at this, it has business leaders, community leaders, large commercial property owners, both owner-occupied and landlords, residential property owners or residential real estate agent, architect, green building engineer, experts. Important town committees need to be on it, the selectmen, town staff. If you know anyone that you think would be an excellent candidate, please let Mark Sandine, Ricky, or me know. We're recruiting now. We have the advantage of following cities like Cambridge. We would most likely use a process similar to theirs. We recommend using consultants to speed up our learning curve and ensure stakeholder buy-in. This task force would develop a plan, a set of recommendations that they would submit to our Board of Selectmen, hopefully a year from when they launch. And this is the draft of the warrant article we have submitted to town meeting to fund advice for the Net Zero Task Force that we're recruiting. It is a draft because we have only met with 3 out of 5 of our selectmen, but those 3 have had a very positive response. Again, it's to fund advice. The benefit of using consultants is that we profit from their expertise and their experience, which is deep, and it will move us up the learning curve very quickly, and time is of the essence. The downside is we need to pay them. Cambridge spent $175,000 on consulting support for their plan. The process took 16 months. We hope that Lexington can do it for significantly less. We're hoping $100,000, perhaps even half of what Cambridge did, $85,000, in 12 months. In a year where funds are tight, finding tens of thousands of dollars is not easy. But this is a fractional amount compared to the millions we are planning to invest in our school and municipal buildings. And this work can inform those decisions and ultimately protect those investments. It is clear that moving on climate change is urgent. We need to tackle our community's largest source of emissions. The sooner we do it, the less disruptive those changes will be, and the sooner we'll see the payback from our investments in efficient, cleaner operations. Sustainable Lexington, Lexington GWAC, and Mothers Out Front hope that you will support this warrant. Thank you.
I'm not clear if this includes residences, condo buildings, apartment buildings. What do you mean by buildings?
Yes, all of the above. All of the above.
All single-family homes?
Yes. And Cambridge has done exactly that as well. Cambridge is actually 80% of their emissions come from their built environment. And they have a plan over 25 years that starts with new buildings, and actually some of their schools are already being built this way, and goes all the way out to retrofits in both residential and commercial to their labs, who are the last to come online because they have the toughest conversion.
That makes a huge difference, both in terms of impact and the resistance.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But this is, as Ann said, and as Ricky said, and as Mike Barrett has said, this is an all-in game. We can't afford to leave anybody behind in this. And that's the job of that task force, is to figure out the financial incentives to get resident X and small business guy Y on board. Yes, George.
Are you asking for a new committee, a task force? And if so, who is that responsible to? What are you asking for organization?
We are asking for an ad hoc citizens task force. And they would report out to the Board of Selectmen.
So,
It would have members from it would have members of Sustainable Lexington, for instance, the Permanent Building Committee, the Historic Commission.
who's in charge of it?
There would be a task force chair, and I imagine ultimately the charge you're reporting to the Board of Selectmen.
There.
Do you have advice for us, George? We'd be happy to take your advice.
Why isn't this Sustainable Lexington Committee doing this?
The Sustainable Lexington Committee will be on this,
Why
but
aren't
one
they
of,
running it? Why aren't they in charge of it?
well, all right, so Marcia Jens might have a better answer because she was on the solar
I'm going
task
to defer
force.
to Dan.
Sure. So I ran the solar task force, so I was the chair.
Do you want to come to the front?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, how are you?
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no problem. So we formed an ad hoc committee, and
Who is we?
Sustainable Lexington proposed that an ad hoc citizens committee be formed to drive the solar program forward in Lexington. And great news, we got our final approval from the Conservation Commission for the recycling centre ground mount. So we'll now have 3 megawatts in Lexington, by the end of this year, ideally. But in part, we didn't form it as a task force reporting to the selectmen or under the authority of the selectmen because it puts a whole lot of constraints on you. As a citizens task force, you have liaisons from various committees. You get together, define a very targeted goal, you drive forward, you go to the selectmen, you propose change, but you have the support of the committees that are involved. But it leaves you somewhat unconstrained, and that's why we modeled it that way, because we were told, well, if you want to have a committee, a formal committee chartered, that will take time, there'll be administration, and we want to drive change efficiently. So we had the liaison from Sustainable Lexington. It was admittedly driven by members of Sustainable Lexington, but we were simply members of a community task force. We had members of the community on it, as well as liaisons with various departments. And the key was we presented a compelling message. We boiled down the goal to dollars, cents, and other environmental impacts, so that it was easy for folks to support. So I would say, the key from our point of view is that we get behind this warrant article because we just don't have time. $150,000 is a small price to pay to help drive this forward. The solar that we've developed as a community task force over the last 2 years is going to provide over $16 million in value over 20 years. So $150,000, I think it's reasonable to ask town government to provide that.
What kind of funding did the solar committee get from the town? Are you making a parallel between these two processes?
Well, it was self-funded by Mark Sandine, myself, and some dedicated volunteers, but we did get funding from the Department of Public Facilities to help on the consulting front. So they were our partners, very, very close partners in the process, because we started with the buildings. So the town made a commitment there, albeit a smaller commitment, but it was a smaller goal. So I think this is incredibly worthwhile. So getting behind the warrant article is critical, absolutely critical. Yep.
Can you help us know when the vote's going to be? Send us something that we can get in touch
Sure
with our
can.
local town
Absolutely.
meeting members and ahead of time so we can work on them a few times.
Yes, absolutely, Zori. We will absolutely do that.
And the volunteers are just so critical to this, because just one voice with a different perspective on that team made all the difference. Every time we came up against a problem, there was just one voice, someone who had a bit of knowledge, stepping in, providing that extra weight that got us over the finish line. I can't emphasize enough how important those citizen volunteers are, particularly on this, because we're stretching across a wide array of disciplines. And I want to say, it's been one or two voices that have been trying to drive thinking on this expansion program we have for the school buildings, it led to a different design process. All right, it hasn't led to success yet, but it led to a different design process, and so that's what we really need. And I would also encourage folks to read very hard and think about the proposals coming to town meeting this year, and ask the question: Have town staff properly considered the effect of climate change in the decisions they're making? Because I'll tell you that the status quo, if you rely on LEED standards, you're going to have a better result than not, but not the result you want. All right? And so that's once again why you need to have voices on the task force. It was one person doing some reading of the Harvard study that looked at the CO2 issue, that raised it in a meeting with the design committee and said, what are our CO2 levels? What are our standards? And lo and behold, what we achieved is quite good, but the minimum standard was well above that level that has been recommended. And so that's why the voice is important.
Well, and the other thing, just to support what Dan said, is that these standards are changing. I mean, you talk to any builder out there today, and the standards that they build to today are vastly improved from the standards they built to 10 or 15 years ago. So if you're going to be in a position where over the life of these buildings, you could build a building that in 10 years does not meet the standard, and then you've got to go back and retrofit it. Let's build it right from the beginning.
Yeah, I really agree with that last question. I'm hoping, Zori, with all of your resources in the building field and through your architects friends, that'd be nice on the night of town meeting if you had some almost expert witness testimony to that point about what's really happening in the movement. I really like the way you set forth the business case. I'm wondering if, when you present this to town meeting, I haven't done town meeting in a while, I have to admit, I assume you'll be able to do a PowerPoint or have some kind of data, and really zeroing in on the cost savings, because you're making a really compelling argument that makes the $100,000 seem very small, given the long-term savings. That said, I do know how hard it is to get things through town meeting. Astoundingly, when I did the anti-idling bylaw 10 years ago, I was just astounded at some of our beloved citizens who said, we have the right to idle our cars. This is what I do for right. And I thought, wow. And I was bringing high schoolers there. That's why we have the anti-idling signs around town. But it was a much smaller ask than this. So I guess I worry. I don't know how hard this will be. Again, $100,000 doesn't sound like much, but if it's a hard ask, can we get some really tight numbers on cost savings, long-term cost savings? It would be really good.
I think that's a fabulous suggestion, and certainly we will try. We'll do our best.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure, George.
Is Joe Paddle, he's still your liaison, right?
Yes.
Is he going to manage this task force?
I would expect that, in the same way that he was a primary supporter of the solar task force, that he'll be checking in on this task force as well.
Well, I'm anticipating that, excuse me for anybody who doesn't know me, but George Brunel, town meeting member and ex-select, I'm anticipating a discussion, and how that is structured, I think, is important and germane to the debate that could take place on town meeting floor or in the information session ahead of town meeting. And the other question is the one on numbers, because when you make a presentation that says it's going to save this money, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, it has to have numbers attached to it, because what you're looking at on the commercial side, as far as I know, there's only one commercial building up for construction at this point in time. That's on Hartwell Avenue, and I'm not sure that this will apply to them, so I don't know how that's going to happen. But the Economic Development Group is entitled to understand the economics on the commercial side. The residents want to understand what this means in terms of residential construction, how that impacts the cost of new houses, what that means. The builders want to know that. And so those questions start getting hard when you get into those groups. So I think the administration of the process and having numbers as to what it really means could be an important part of the discussion. For those of you who are not up to speed on town meeting discussion, we're trying to ask you for $150 million worth of construction, or 100 to 150 million for schools, and nobody can fight much about $100 million because it's too big to handle. So we fight over $100,000.
Yes.
I understand, I get how new buildings can strive to meet these targets, and how, well, new construction. How will this affect, what does the average homeowner of an existing building, what is the expectation that that owner is going to do? What can that owner do? I live in the woods, I can't use solar panels, but what kinds of things are going to, what kinds of obligations or goals are going to be imposed on Lexingtonians to contribute to this effort?
Sure, absolutely. Well, we would, the task force would explore that. I am not a builder, I'm not an expert in this. I have retrofitted my own house. We've done a lot of insulation and various things, and changed heating systems, etc., to make it cleaner. But we would obviously we would consult builders about that. We would consult people like Integral Group, Rocky Mountain Institute, who have done this in all sorts of cities and towns, and they would be able to give you a long list of things that they do for homeowners.
I think it would be helpful if you brought it down to the level of the average citizen or the average town meeting member that's going to be voting for this, but how it's going to affect.
Yeah, so listen, a great example, a really straightforward example, and this is why you asking that question is key, because everyone should be asking that question, right? What can I do if I have a building that's 100 years old, I'm in the same spot, I can't get sun on my roof because I have magnificent trees shading my house? So you should be asking that question, and one of the answers would be, well, there's a community solar program that's out there that we haven't tapped into as a town, and in fact, could very well disappear if the bill before the House were to go through. And so that community solar program would provide anyone in Lexington with the opportunity to completely offset or purchase their energy from a solar farm or a similar facility. But that's just an example of, we could sit here and say, oh my God, we're going to spend massive amounts of money with our home trying to get to net zero. Alternatively, make sure the rules are in place so we can actually build our own energy source or share an energy source that can be built on available land. So for instance, in hindsight, 2 years from now, if we were to have done the solar farm out on Lexington, Harville Avenue, we've built 2.5 megawatts out there. We could have built 8, 9. If folks in the town were asking for it and saying, we want to have a solar alternative to burning fossil fuels in our home, and so that's an option, but they're the sorts of discussions we have to have. And the reason the task force is so important is because you get some people in the room thinking about it and come up with pretty quick solutions. It's then critical to have enough folks to engage stakeholders and explain it.
Also, the timeline. Remember, the timeline is 25 to 35 years. So nobody is going to come to you next year and say, you need to do this.
Yeah, in Cambridge, it really is about offsets. So with the residential homes that are in place right now, they're basically saying, 5, 10 years from now, we should have renewable resource available that you can purchase to completely offset your energy load in houses that have been made as efficient as possible.
Sure. So add 2 things. One is,
Can I just say one more thing to that answer before you speak? It's important that everybody gets an energy audit, which you can have every 2 years, and it's totally free. And it will give you some ideas of where you can go. It can give you, you know, so we have some things in place to get you going on that. So you may have had one, and maybe you haven't done everything you can do. But if you are at net zero, think of the money you're saving. So there's a balance to the issue. You make an investment, but then you know, and then you go to sell your house, and you go, my house is net zero. Isn't this great? So these are things that have intrinsic value just by doing them.
Yes.
So my 2 things. One was I just wondered if anybody who's a town meeting member or who's running for town meeting could raise your hand right now, just so people know. Okay.
Thank you for coming.
That's one. That was one. And the other was, you know, building on what George was saying, the numbers are important, but really I think what you're talking about is is letting people know about the process for sort of one-stop shopping for if you're an individual who's trying to think about what they can do in their tree-laden area. They're not their relatives in California, you know, understanding that this process won't be imposing a one-size-fits-all solution on every person.
Yeah.
That New England is different than California. We have different resources to draw on. There's some things that can fit across the country. There's some things that are going to be tailored locally. And then all the resources. I mean, I've had my energy, I mean, my own little case in 2 sons is I've had my energy audit done. I've tried to get solar panels 4 times. They refuse every time because of the trees. I've had people say to me, well, we cut down some trees to put up our solar panels, and who would help me weigh that decision? I bought a car. I ended up, you know, with all the things trying to weigh. I'm a short person, wanted to carry a bunch of kids occasionally, but not always. So we have a Prius. We used to have a van. Now we have a slightly smaller thing that can carry more.
Good for you.
But I hate, you know, I drive around and I think about, I'm conscious about the gas that I use. So I think
well, thank you for that.
But I think helping people to understand that they don't have to be at net zero right away. If they're making progress, if they're understanding the resources, they're drawing together, that that's the kind of progress you're looking for.
Yes, yes. No, I think those are excellent points. Yes.
So being a town meeting member and seeing how few are here, I think one of the most important things is not bringing it when it's town meeting, when we're having the meeting. I think we should have educational stuff beforehand, before the warrant, before anything. And I think putting everything you have online and telling town meeting, this is what this is where it exists, this is how you get it, and hopefully, people will read it. But you're doing your part is the most important thing you can do, because town meeting sort of waits until the night we're voting on it to talk, instead of reading and learning beforehand, coming to places like this and asking the questions they spend the time at town meeting doing, when they could have done it here. So I just want to tell you to just please give the information, put it in the paper. 90% of people don't read the paper, but
I gotta say, I think there are a chunk of people who do preparation ahead of time.
Yes.
And there's a chunk of people who find out that night, and you have to cater to both.
Yeah.
And it's a public education what happens at town meeting, because it's publicized. It's worth it to be able to go through it swiftly and efficiently then.
Yeah, yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that advice. Edward, yes.
What's the status of that
Wave your
community
hand.
choice
There's somebody here.
for the provider?
Aggregation.
Yeah.
I don't know. You need to talk to my friend Mark Sandine about that. I don't know whether, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, so I'm trying to think, is Todd still here? So we didn't talk about that on Tuesday night, but there's a process and there's a team that's responsible for driving that forward. And I think it's is it the Energy Conservation Committee that is participating in that as well?
Yeah.
Community choice aggregation.
There was some legislation that kind of threw a
Spanner
in the works on that for a bit, but there is that meeting, the MAPC is having a meeting on Monday talking about community choice aggregation, so it is still alive.
So the process is rolling forward, and it's an education, information gathering, process. But But that is one of those little task forces that are so important to these.
So it won't be for this town meeting, it'll be for a future.
Right, I think when we talked about it last year, it was about getting support to investigate it and you know, come up with recommendations.
Lisa, I just wanted to quickly say, am I correct? I believe the warrant article is really, for this town meeting, is really focused on getting a consultant to come and help this task force so
Yes.
that a lot of these questions can be answered through that work of the task force.
Yes.
So all the questions about what are we going to have to do, what am I going to have to do, what are businesses going to have to do, isn't that what the task force work
Yes.
is?
Yes.
So I think that helping to really let people know what they're voting on and what they're not voting on, and I think will be really, really important, so that, because I think people will get immediately into what are you telling me I have to do, and that's really not what this is, and I think we want to be sure that people understand what this is and what this isn't.
And that they can participate.
Exactly, right.
If you're concerned about it, join us and.
So answering a lot of the technical questions, I think, might be well-meaning, but it might actually be doing work that the task force really needs to do before they can be answered entirely.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, right here in the. Sorry.
You gave a long list of small cities, for the most part, that have adopted this goal.
Mhm.
And I imagine some of them have been doing this for a few years now. Are there any results?
Probably the furthest would probably be Fort Collins. They started earlier, and they are piloting a new business paradigm for their utility right now. But this is pretty, in general, it's pretty recent. It's something that these people, you know, when you're looking at it, these are things that were task forces and cities that are adopting these things in 2013, 2014, 2015.
So it's too early to say.
Yeah, so it's too early in a 25 to 35-year plan to know. Yes.
Just to mention, in British Columbia, it's part of the law that part of the money from the carbon tax should go back to the municipalities, and all of them have to be net zero by 2018. That's just the municipal buildings and so on. The Vancouver group or whatever is going beyond that, and there is a report on the net. You can see what they have achieved so far.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Vancouver, British Columbia would probably be the place that I would look that would be the most advanced in this for those numbers. Thank you all. Yes?
When you come before town meeting, could you be prepared to briefly explain why the LEEDs standard that we adopted several years ago is inadequate for achieving what you want?
I mean, it simply evolves. So they update LEED, but LEED isn't the forward edge. In part because it's almost, think of it as a regulatory. It's not regulatory, but think of it as a regulatory tool. So once a technology and a concept has been thoroughly tried and tested and has been voted on,
then it gets
up and down, then and it's passed the test of the building industry, and it's pushed back against all that resistance, then finally it becomes part of LEED standard. Now, I for one don't want to have to wait the 10 years it takes for them to catch up with the Harvard study, you know, before looking at the CO2 levels in our schools. And so the LEED is an excellent tool to manage the kind of general standards we want across buildings. But certainly when it comes to municipal buildings, I think we want to be thinking a little bit, we want to be leading LEED. You know, in certain areas, not across the board, but just in certain areas.
Sorry?
Roughly when will the vote be?
The vote will be at town meeting in April.
So
for this,
early
for the vote
April,
for
late April, whatever. Something more.
You don't know.
We don't know
But
yet.
it's definitely, because there is a workshop on March 8th on a guide to carbon neutral cities, using some cities in Europe that the Northeast Sustainability Association, NESI, is having. So I can send this to you. You can put it on the
Absolutely.
website. If
Thank
people
you
want to go,
so much.
those places have been doing it longer than we have. We may not be able to have US examples, but.
Thank you. I look forward to getting that from you, Zoe. Thanks a lot. Fran?
How about the other two selectmen? Is there any point in?
Oh, we're going to touch base with them. We have been touching base with them. We just have had scheduling issues.
Okay.
So.
But if you need support from the public on that front.
The selectmen have been fantastic so far.
Great.
So I've been delighted. So if we need to call in reinforcements, Fran, we'll let you know. Thank you.
A question?
Yes.
So your task force was, no,
Mine, okay,
you
sure.
was just for solar energy? Is that what, I mean, because people said, why doesn't your task force doing it?
Oh, no, sorry. So Sustainable Lexington has a broad mandate. It's a selectmen's committee. One of the projects that we chose, or that we focused on, was municipal solar. And to advance that, we proposed creating the ad hoc task force.
Right.
And so then so Mark Sandine's the chair of Sustainable Lexington. I worked with him on that committee, and I took on the chair role of the solar task force.
So the question is, are you willing to take on this task force that we want to, I mean, is that, I mean, because people said, why not you guys?
Well, I mean, this is a project that is important to Sustainable Lexington, but it's also important to GWAC, Mothers Out Front, and a range of stakeholder groups within.
Right.
Yeah. So think of the Sustainable Lexington presence on that task force as, you know, the sort of selectmen's mandated committee presence. But the power of the task force is that you do have other groups, you know, really driving it forward as well.
The task force
And the request for the funds
Yes.
actually comes from Sustainable Lexington.
Okay, that's what it's for.
It comes from Sustainable Lexington.
Okay. Ricky, are we good?
Yeah, I just want to say we will post this,
PowerPoint slide?
Yeah, we will post this PowerPoint. We will put a link to Cambridge so you can see their Gantt chart on how long these, you know, we don't expect it tomorrow. And stay tuned because we will be doing more information sessions about this. So thank you all for coming.